Hello everyone. I have decided to go birding this beautiful Saturday morning with my Tamron 150 to 600 millimeter lens attached to my EOS R5 with an adapter. Once attached, I can hear a little bit of a click, but I hope it works okay. In my camera, I use three custom modes for birds in flight, usually custom mode 2. The shutter speed is usually at 1 in 1600. The f-stop is usually wide open depending on the lens. ISO is auto ISO. I usually shoot compressed RAW plus JPEG. And I use high speed plus at 20 frames per second electronic shutter with AI servo, and I use a single autofocus point as default. Now this camera is set to focus using back button focus, and if I click the AF on button, it'll focus using a single autofocus point. So if there's a bird right there, then I would use the AF on button for back button focus. I can move the autofocus point around using the joystick, but I find it much easier when looking through the viewfinder to use the portion of the screen on the right to move it, and it moves very quickly, much quicker than using the joystick. If the bird is stationary, then I can use the star button for eye autofocus, and if it sees the eye, it'll detect and focus on the eye 90% of the time. I'm driving to a nature park near my home, and there's a lake here that's frequented by birds. So we'll see how lucky I get this morning. Some mornings I go to the lake and come back empty-handed. Some days are better than others. So it looks like there's a few cars here today, people fishing. Well, do I see any birds? I think I see something over there. And what is it? It looks like it's a snowy egret. Are there any other birds? I don't think so. Maybe a few ducks. Let's scan the horizon. No other big birds except the snowy egret. And it looks like it's walking around trying to search for fish. This is shot using the Tamron 150 to 600 at 600 millimeters handheld using the R5, and it's doing a pretty good job steadying the camera. It looks like the bird has spotted something. You can see how it changes its body language. It's shifting its head and neck to one side. I have this on eye autofocus, and I take this opportunity to click a few shots. There it is looking into the water. I think it spotted a fish. And there it's diving down. You can barely see the wings above the water. And there it comes up with a fish. And as I'm shooting, the bird takes off. And I got a few shots in flight, and here I have it on eye autofocus, and it did a beautiful job capturing the bird. There's a trail here that leads up to a beautiful overlook, and sometimes I get lucky here with birds in flight, especially vultures, eagles, and so forth. And here are a few shots using my previous camera, the 5D Mark IV. That was a great camera. The autofocus on the R5 is in a different league, and I'm able to get much more keepers using the R5. This is an edited JPEG from the EOS R5, and I wanted to test how much I could push the JPEGs compared to the RAW files. So on the left, I have the RAW file opened using the painfully slow DPP, and on the right is Lightroom. And I want to see if I can push the sliders and try to get them to match. So on DPP, I'm going to push the shadows all the way up, and I'm going to do the same on Lightroom as well. Now Lightroom will let you push the shadows much more than on DPP, but if you push it all the way to 100%, it does look a little unnatural. So here you can see that the shadows are brought out a little more on Lightroom. Let me make that a little less bright, so it looks a little more natural. And I think overall the JPEG did a really great job compared to the raw image. Now let me try to also adjust the exposure. Well, that's too much. If I pull it all the way, obviously the JPEG is way more blown out, but I would never do that in real life. So let me adjust the exposure a little bit on both DPP and Lightroom. And I think they both look comparable. Okay, so I don't necessarily see any loss of image detail on the JPEG file compared to the RAW file, and obviously there's a huge difference in the image size on both. I think the RAW file is almost 40 megabytes and the JPEG is only 12 megabytes. So here I wanted to see the difference between JPEG and RAW files when the images were underexposed by up to 5 stops. So on the left is the DPP RAW image, and on the right is a corresponding JPEG image. And the image is backlit, and this image is somewhat evenly exposed for the face, maybe very slightly underexposed. And you can see that the JPEG and the RAW, there's not much of a difference between the two. And obviously you can play with the sliders a little bit and increase the exposure, bring out the shadows, and the JPEG image looks pretty good, and you can do the same with the RAW image, and they both look comparable. So if the image is evenly exposed, I really don't see any difference between JPEG and RAW. And I don't see why I would be shooting RAW if I feel I've nailed the exposure. Now let's see another image that is underexposed by 1 stop and bring out the same on Lightroom JPEG. So this is underexposed by 1 stop, and let me move the sliders on DPP. Now DPP is painfully slow for some reason. So here, that looks pretty good, and now doing the same with Lightroom. Even if it is underexposed by 1 stop, I think the JPEG and RAW images are pretty similar. This image is underexposed by 2.5 to 3 stops. And let's see what we can do on the JPEG images, bringing out the exposure. Now here you can see there is some noise is starting to creep up in the shadow areas. Let's do the same on the RAW file. Increase exposure, increase the shadows, and obviously this image is very usable on both. The shadow area here does not have much noise, but if I bring down the shadows on Lightroom, the images look very comparable. So even after 2 stops, there's not much of a difference. Obviously the RAW file will have a little more detail in the shadows and show less noise. Now here is one that's about 3 stops underexposed. And let's play with the sliders again in Lightroom. So here you see that there is significantly more amount of noise in the shadow areas. Let's try to play with the sliders in DPP on the RAW file. And DPP doesn't let you increase the exposure or the shadows beyond a certain limit. But again, this appears to be a cleaner file. The RAW file appears to be a cleaner file, which would be expected when it is severely underexposed. Now here's one that's 4 stops underexposed. And let's play with the sliders on Lightroom, bringing up the exposure. Bringing up the shadows. Now here, obviously, the image completely falls apart. Let's try what happens with the RAW file. Again, very laggy. DPP is very slow. Now, obviously, this is not as bright as Lightroom, but I think it is a much more usable image than the JPEG file. Now here's an image that is 5 stops underexposed. So let's see what happens with the JPEG file. I'm improving the exposure, increasing the shadows, and this is a totally useless file. There's no details at all. Let's see what happens with the RAW image. So for some reason I can't increase the shadows when it's so underexposed in DPP. That's probably because Canon knows the image is going to fall apart. But let's see what else I can do. So let me play with these sliders here and see if I can brighten up the image. There you go. So wow. So here, you can actually see some details in the face, and obviously this is not a very usable image, but it is much better than JPEG. So, for my usage, I think I've convinced myself that if your image is properly exposed, you really don't need a RAW image. If it's underexposed by one stop, the JPEG is just as good as RAW. If you're underexposed by two stops, the RAW file is a little better than the JPEG image. And obviously, if it's any more underexposed, the RAW files are definitely better. But considering the amount of space that the RAW images take, I think I'll just stick to JPEG. And I think I'll be writing the RAW images to the CF Express card just as a backup. And if there's that one particular picture that I think will be great, and it happens to be underexposed severely, then I might bring that RAW file back and play with it and see if I can get a usable picture. I wanted to compare the compressed RAW to the RAW image. So the RAW is on top and compressed RAW is below. So moving the sliders on the RAW image in DPP on an image that was underexposed by 5 stops, I get a fairly usable image. Now let's see what happens with the compressed RAW. Exposure, shadows. So to my eye, the RAW and the compressed image look pretty similar. I tried several images, and in some of them I thought perhaps there was a teeny bit more noise in the shadows in the compressed RAW compared to the RAW image. Nothing that some noise reduction wouldn't fix. So I think the compressed RAW and RAW are pretty much similar, and if you're worried about space, you could just use compressed RAW instead of RAW. So in conclusion, I feel the JPEG and RAW files are pretty similar when correcting up to one stop of underexposure. The RAW files, however, are definitely better beyond 2 stops of underexposure. And when comparing the RAW and the cRAW images, they're pretty much similar, but the cRAW file size is much smaller than RAW. Thank you for watching and happy birding.